Alright, I'm taking Pokemon, its 18 types and their interactions, obliterating them, and rebuilding the type chart with the power of mathematics. Now we'll go over just how unbalanced the type chart actually is, because I promise it's worse than you realize, and the changes we can make to fix it. I'll even share the mathy spreadsheet that I made so you can try your hand at overhauling the type chart as well. Hey, I'm Gabe, aka Froopy Art, and you can normally find me making Fakemon and fan regions and other fun stuff like that. I like Pokemon, I think about Pokemon a lot, and this type chart problem is something that I have been working on for months and months and months, and because there isn't anyone out there who can pretend like the Pokemon type chart is perfectly balanced. I mean, you can't tell me that Bug or Ice is as good as Steel or Fairy. I mean, you may want to run an Ice type move, but being an Ice type sucks. And Bug type is just, Bug type's real bad. So, as we're looking at changing things, we need to have some goals in mind. So first off, every type should be equally viable. Now, that doesn't mean that every type is going to have the same number of advantages and disadvantages. We still want them to feel unique, but they should all be roughly the same level of good. You'll always have Pokemon who are great because of their stats or their abilities or their moves, but we don't want to punish any Pokemon just because of its base type. Secondly, monotypes and dual types. We basically want to make sure that the extra coverage that dual type gets doesn't completely overshadow monotypes. And lastly, battle interactions. This will cover a number of smaller things, but we basically want to make sure there aren't any mechanically unbalanced interactions that feel unfair. I've got some surprising tweaks that'll address issues that you probably didn't even realize were there. Now, if you are familiar with my channel, you may recall that I tried to fix the Pokemon type chart once before. But it's been over a year and a half since that kind of rushed attempt, and after a bunch of very helpful and very angry comments, I have identified two major areas where I failed. First of all, while mathematically weaknesses and resistances cancel each other out, when you're determining goodness, it's actually way better to do super effective damage than it is to resist it. That'll be more clear when we get to the fun maths later on. And secondly, I didn't do a great job of maintaining what made each of the types unique. So for instance, I took away too many of Steel type's resistances, and it was no longer the standout defensive type. So what I did is I sent a poll out to get the community's collective impressions of the types. I was able to assemble data on all of their ideal offensive and defensive capabilities, along with anything that should make them unique, and some other questions that helped with this reworking as a whole. So if you were one of the nerds who filled out that survey, thank you very much. It was so helpful. Okay, now I have a really important warning for you. There are some people out there who are pretty opposed to any changes to Pokemon at all. You may squeeze a couple slight tweaks past them, but they like things just as they are. I'm not one of those people, okay? I'm ready for something drastic. So, if you're opposed to any change, then pretend I'm not even talking about Pokemon. Pretend I'm talking about Froopymon or something, you know, completely different, all right? Because I'm ready to, I'm gonna be pretty brutal, so prepare yourself. This is the fire type. It can't be burned. This, grass type, doesn't have to worry about powder or spore moves. This is the steel type. You can't poison it, doesn't have to worry about chip damage from sandstorm. And this is bug. Bug doesn't get anything. So while there are some really amazing effects that different types get across the chart, let's see, Poor, Normal, Water, Fighting, Psychic, Dragon, and Fairy are all lacking innate effects in battle. We'll get to the tweaks and the additions, but I wanted to make sure that every type had something to offer. Now, you may be thinking that giving every type a unique effect exasperates the difference between monotypes and dual types, and you're totally right. So there's something else that we'll do to help balance that out. Right now, all the types get stab, or same type attack bonus. That means that when they're using moves of their type, they deal 1.5 times as much damage. Pretty great. Especially great if you've been a dual type this whole time and you can hit a whole bunch of stuff. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take dual types, stab, and drop it down to times 1.25 instead. The damage output between the two doesn't actually change that much, and it lets our monotypes be a little bit more consistent with limited targets, while our dual types still can hit a lot of stuff and are guaranteed that second effect. Though there is one special case that I'll talk about. So if I'm a dual type and both of my types hit a type for super effective damage, it's not really fair to just get the 1.25 times multiplier on that. So for instance, if I was a grass and water type, I actually hit both ground and rock for super effective damage with both types, but I don't want to lose out on that. So in those instances, I will get the 1.5 stab on those types. We don't want to penalize a dual type just for having its attacking things line up. Yeah. Oh, and there's one other thing that I wanted to implement, but I couldn't figure out how. Ideally, your primary type and secondary type would matter. It matters which one's first and which one's second. Like you would hit harder with whichever one you had first. You get more stab with that and less stab with the second maybe. But the problem is like you would just want your stronger attacking type in the first and the other one wouldn't really matter. You could try and work in defenses with that, but it gets way too complicated. So if you have a way that could matter, let me know down in the comments, because it kind of broke my brain trying to figure out an elegant solution for that. Okay, this is actually a holdover from the last time I tried to fix the type chart. So if you're a dual type and you have two weaknesses that overlap, you take 4 times damage. That seems to make sense, right? Times 2 and times 2. Times 4, right? But mathematically, you end up taking a lot more damage this way than if the weaknesses had been separate. So, as not to overly punish those with double weaknesses, instead of taking 4 times damage, you're taking 3 times. You can think about it like this. If you got a weakness and you get hit, you say, oh, that hurt so much that I'm gonna take that damage again. So, 2 weaknesses on top of each other, like, oh, that hurt, I'm gonna take that damage again. And then again, so that's where you're times 3. I hope that makes sense. Okay, this is a big change, and I promise if you stick with me, you will really appreciate how interesting it makes things. Right now, I find immunities to be kind of boring, and also mathematically, they make it really difficult to balance things. Okay, here's a couple examples. Say you are a grass and flying type. Grass resists ground, but flying is immune to it, so that resistance doesn't even matter. Meanwhile, your buddy, who is electric and flying, should be afraid of ground, but they're also immune. These two overlapping things are not fair, so we're gonna tweak that. Okay, maybe tweak is the wrong word. What I am proposing is pretty drastic, but please just bear with me. I promise you it makes things a lot more interesting. We're gonna get rid of immunities on the type chart. We're not getting rid of immunities completely. Instead, whenever you have 2 resistances that overlap and normally you would take quarter damage from, that's now just an immunity. I mean, mathematics aside, I think this makes immunities way more interesting, and you actually end up with more of them across the whole Pokedex because of it. Sprinkle in a few abilities here and there to help monotypes still get immunities, and yeah, we've got something really interesting, a lot less predictable. I think it's fun. I think it's a huge improvement. But I get it. You know, some of you are never going to be okay with types losing their innate immunities, like, you know, steel should always be immune to poison because robots can't be poisoned type of nonsense. Whatever, you know, even though steel, like some Pokemon just have steel pieces, they're not just robot. Whatever, we're getting rid of it. I'm sorry. No system is gonna make everybody happy, but I really do think this is a huge improvement. Okay, assuming I didn't lose absolutely everybody after that last bombshell, we're just about ready to work on the type chart itself, but let's talk about how we got here. This should come as no surprise, but when Game Freak started with Generation 1, they had no idea that they were creating a juggernaut that would span multiple generations through the decades. So they just kind of slapped it together. That's why Bug was hot garbage from the beginning, Psychic was an overpowered mess. With Gen 2, they attempted to balance things with a couple new types that smashed Psychic down into the ground, so that's good, getting better. Over the years, some more slight changes. Fairy shows up, it smashes Dragon also down into the ground. So it was getting better, but not nearly good enough. And there's a reason for that, right? Game Freak knew that they couldn't make huge sweeping changes. It would just be too overwhelming. So they had to settle for these teeny tiny little baby steps. But for this video, it's all hypothetical, so I don't have to hold back. And we're just gonna flip this table on end. Now, one more thing that I will mention before we get to our mathy spreadsheet, and this is something that, honestly, it took me a while to come to terms with. Ideally, the interactions are thematically justified. Grass gets burned by fire, fire gets put out by water, water gets all slurped up by grass, that type of nonsense, right? But I think we can all agree that there are already interactions on the type chart that don't really make a whole lot of sense. So as I'm rebalancing things, the mathematics and the fairness come first, and hopefully we can justify everything as we go. Okay, but if you want to get upset why type X should resist Z and be weak to Y or whatever, go for it. It's kind of a dangerous rabbit hole to start going down, but I understand. But when push comes to shove, I will be yielding to mechanical balancing over justifying every interaction. That being said, I think I did a pretty good job at justifying most of this stuff, and the ones that are a little iffy, I kind of want your feedback on anyway. I created this in Google Sheets. There's a link down in the description, so you are free to copy it and try messing around with it on your own. I won't go into all the details and all the functions and whatnot that I used. The basic thing you need to know is that if you copy a weakness, resistance, or immunity, if you want to use those, and drop them into the table, it will automatically calculate the offenses and defenses of the type and give you a goodness score for that. Oh, and before we go any further, I will acknowledge that there are plenty of people out there who don't think that the type chart should be balanced. They think that there are some types like Bug that should kind of be bad, and there are other types like Dragon that should be stronger than everything else. I disagree with that. I think that Pokemon can be good or bad depending on their stats, moves, abilities, all that good stuff. But even if you want it to be imbalanced, you can still take a look in the description, play with the chart, make your own version. It's fun stuff. Now, the most crucial piece of this spreadsheet are these numbers down here. I realized in all of the time that I spent on this project that not only should weaknesses and resistances be valued differently, but the number of each also affects the goodness in different ways. Dealing with weaknesses and doing super effective damage ends up being pretty straightforward, and there's a linear relationship between the two. So having 4 weaknesses ends up being twice as bad as having 2 weaknesses. Makes sense. Now, resistances, on the other hand, is where it gets a little bit weird, as there isn't a normal linear relationship between how many resistances you have and how good you are. Having a single resistance is almost useless. Sure, you could switch into an attack, but normally it just doesn't help you. But as you add more and more resistances, things start getting exponentially better. Your odds of affecting what your opponent can use on you go way up, and you can switch into tons of moves. It's good times, but yeah, it's exponential growth. Now, I will save you all of the mind-numbing calculations and consultations with competitive players, but these are the numbers that I landed on, and I'm pretty confident about them. That being said, as you are playing with this chart, you can modify any of these values and it will automatically update the rest of the spreadsheet. Again, the link to that is down in the description, so play with it, have fun. And actually, just for comparison, we can take the existing type chart and drop it into this table. Now, this doesn't take into consideration things like existing type effects, move pools, and what types are brought up by being good against the other top types, and other meta elements like that. But even after those adjustments, things don't look great, right? It's kind of just fundamentally broken, and we've just, I don't know, learned to live with it over the years. So, what do we get instead? Well, after literal months of work, this is the type chart that we get. There's a lot of changes. Most of that is getting rid of those immunities that we talked about. But let's go ahead and take a look at all of the types. Oh, and as we do, they will be accompanied by Fakemon of mine. And if you like that type of thing, be sure to check out my ongoing Cryptid and Gravity Falls inspired region, Pokemon Eclipse. It's pretty neat. I think you'll like it. Okay, let's jump into the types.
Grass. The grass type. It needed some love. And the main thing we did is to remove some of the types that were resisting it. It was a little ridiculous. It will now be able to hit fire, flying, and dragon for neutral damage. Defensively, it's gaining a resistance to fairy, and also loses a weakness to flying. As of the starting types, its defenses were pretty abysmal, so yeah, this is a good change. And it will also keep its immunity to powder and spore moves. This is one of those abilities that doesn't really come up that often in regular gameplay, but you can't really argue with its competitive utility. Fire is next, and offensively it is still hitting the same stuff. People wanted fire to remain offensive. It will be, of course, resisted by ground type. I don't know why it wasn't like that already, because it makes sense. Defensively, just going off of the poll results, people view the fire type as ideally being far less defensive than it currently is. So it is no longer going to resist grass, bug, steel, or fairy. But to balance that out a bit, it's also losing its weakness to rock. I don't know, toss some sand on a fire and you're likely to put it out, but a few stones won't do much in comparison, so yeah, we're gonna get rid of that. For its type effect, fire just retains an immunity to burn. Water. People feel that water is a more balanced type, and with a few tweaks, we maintained that. Offensively, nothing is changing, save for one thing, ice gaining a resistance. Poor ice needs the help anyway. Defensively, we're taking what was an ice resistance and turning that into a weakness. You know, flipping this relationship just makes a lot more sense to me anyway. And poison is going to be able to contaminate water with super effective damage, but water does gain a rock resistance. For its effect in battle, water types will now receive a 10% speed boost in the rain. It's not much, and you could maybe tweak that down to 5%, but it's something to play with. Let me know if you think there's a certain value that it hits the sweet spot. Normal. Now, the last time I did this, I made a huge mistake by letting normal hit fairy for super effective damage, not realizing that since nearly every Pokemon had access to decent normal type moves, that hurt the fairy type like really, really bad. So normal is going to go back to not doing any super effective damage at all. But since I am now only giving it one resistance, being Ghost, you can't have any dual types that develop an immunity to normal. This is the only type that can never be negated, which is appropriate for the type. In addition to that, to make things nice and reliable, it's also no longer resisted by rock or steel. Definitely not a flashy type, since you'll never do super effective damage, but boring and reliable nonetheless. Defensively, normal resists Ghost, but we're going to remove its weakness to fighting. Now, as a reminder, each type is getting a battle effect, and some are going to be better than others. Right now, after these tweaks, normal's utility makes it better than most types. So, Normal ends up with one of the only, less good effects. And as such, it is simply immune to curse. Boring and super situational, sure, but it helps knock the type back down a hair. Electric. People were in agreement that overall it mechanically just felt kind of boring compared to some of the other types, so offensively we are now letting it hit steel types for super effective damage, which is nice. But it is now resisted by rock types as they're pretty darn similar to ground types. Meanwhile, ground types are no longer completely immune to electric now. This is one of the immunities that was tough to get rid of, but again, I really find that the new immunity interactions are just far more dynamic. And of course, electric still doesn't have to worry about paralysis. Another goodie. Ice. Ice is one of the types that definitely needed some tweaking. Again, it was always good to run an ice type move, but being an actual ice type just sucks. So offensively, it actually gets to hit water types now. We covered that, so that's fun. People really wanted ice to stand alone as the glass cannon hitting the most types. But to balance that out, it is now resisted by fighting, rock, and dark. Thematically, I don't super love these interactions. I have some half-baked ideas why, but for balancing, we're just gonna have to live with them. I would love to hear any justifications that you have for fighting rock and dark, resisting ice down in the comments below. So yeah, let me know. Defensively, ice is getting a huge overhaul, losing a weakness to steel and gaining resistances to water, flying, and dragon. But ice types will remain frail stat-wise to balance this out. For its effect, ice types are still immune to freeze, but I know that this is a fairly rare status ailment, so I also went back and forth about maintaining this last generation's snow weather boosting defenses, and settled on having that boost be only 10% to defenses instead of 25. Feel free to convince me of a better number though. Fighting. People were a fan of the fighting type having a lot of strengths and weaknesses and just being a more disciplined type to use, so I made sure to maintain that. Offensively, it doesn't get to hit normal for super effective damage anymore, that's kind of a bummer, which also lets ice be our single highest hitting type. And instead of fairy resisting fighting, fighting will just resist itself. Equally matched martial artists blocking each other's blows. Defensively, we're taking away its weakness to fairy, which really never made sense to me, and then we're swapping its resistance to rock for ice. For its effect, all fighting types are unaffected by flinch. This is fun and thematic, that their training has allowed them to remain steadfast against attacks that would mess with others. Poison time. Offensively, it now hits water for super effective damage. That's fun and thematic, I love it. And it's able to hit steel types now as well as they've lost their complete immunity. Again, a reminder, there are a bunch of acid-based moves that metal reasonably would not be completely immune to. Defensively, we are just swapping a fairy resistance for steel, and of course it gets to continue not being worried about the poison condition. Ground. This is one that really needed some reworking. Conceptually, the poll showed that people were in agreement that ground was too much of an offensive threat and needed to be balanced out. Offensively, it's taking a hit, no longer being super effective against rock and steel. I expect people to fight me on this, but I personally was never satisfied with the ground is a good against rocks and steel because of earthquakes can break everything argument, because again, earthquakes break everything. Also, it's going to resist itself, which is fun, and bugs no longer resist ground, also good. But most exciting is that flying has lost its complete immunity. Most ground type attacks can hit them now, though we'll get to the details of that when we get to the flying type. And to balance things out, ground is also receiving a resistance to flying. It's no longer completely immune to electric and instead just has a normal resistance. It does gain a resistance to fire, which is nice, and it again resists itself. It does, however, gain a weakness to bug, as they are just so good at burrowing down into the ground. For their effect, ground types still don't have to worry about Sandstorm Chip, making them the only ones immune to it. Flying. Okay, we've got some fun changes for flying. Offensively, they don't get to hit grass types for super effective damage. Grass needed the help. The reasoning people often use is that birds use vegetation to make their nests, but also, like, most animals use vegetation to make their nest for their dens and whatnot, so that always felt pretty flimsy to me. And then, rock and steel no longer resist it, but it is resisted by ice and ground. Defensively, it no longer resists grass either, and of course it's losing its immunity to ground, but its ability will offset that. And then it actually gets to lose its rock weakness. People wanted flying to kind of stand apart from the chart, like it's above it, and I actually like how that turned out. Okay, so for the effect, it is still immune to all the same entry hazards, spikes, toxic spikes, sticky web, and also all the terrain thingies, but we're also going to expand that immunity to any moves that specifically utilize the ground itself. There would maybe need to be a tag for these moves, but there are things like dig, earthquake, fissure, and also potentially some non-ground type moves too. Be sure to let me know if there are any other moves that flying types should be able to ignore with this. Psychic. Definitely needed some help. People wanted this to be more of a threat again, and closer to the glass cannon territory. It's now able to mess up steel types. This is really just based on the whole bending metal objects like spoons with your mind. It's pretty silly, but hey, we got a whole Pokemon line based off of that. Dark types are losing their immunity, so psychics can hit them for a little bit of damage. Defensively, it is gaining a resistance to fairy, but no longer resists itself. I did make sure to maintain our 3 weaknesses, being the fears, bugs, ghosts, and the dark. Oh, and for the effect, psychic types no longer have to worry about becoming confused by the enemy. Their own moves can leave them confused, but opponents can't get them all mixed up. That feels nice and thematic. Bug. The type that needed the most help. It was just a mess before, so let's see what we can do. Offensively, it isn't going to be super effective against dark, since that interaction never made a ton of sense to me in the first place, and will hit ground types instead. But more importantly, a bunch of stuff no longer resists bug. Fire, poison, ghost, and fairy all can be hit normally. So that's just much better for poor bug. Defensively, it no longer resists ground, but their alien buggy minds resist psychic instead. Oh, and for the effect, since bugs' minds just work a little different, we're giving them something a bit situational, but a little fun, which is an immunity to taunt. Bug doesn't care if you want them to only attack. Bug does its own thing. Rock. Another type that people wanted to see an improvement to, specifically making it more defensive. But first, offensively, it is no longer super effective against fire or flying. We went over the whys in those sections. It isn't resisted by fighting or ground anymore, but water resists it. Now, defensively, it may not resist normal or flying anymore, but it does resist both ice and electric, and on top of that, it is losing its weakness to ground. Now, as for the effect, it doesn't get to be immune to Sandstorm Chip, since that's for ground, and sandstorms eroding rocks is like 100% a real thing, so it's definitely not getting a special defense boost in sandstorms either, so we're going to throw something completely new at rock. It is still affected by entry hazards like spikes and stealth rocks and stuff like that, but after it takes their effects, it clears them. I think that's pretty fun. Pretty fun. Ghost. We've got a couple small tweaks for Ghost. Offensively, it's still hitting the same types, but of course it has lost its complete immunity to normal. In addition to this, instead of Dark resisting Ghost, Fairy and Dragon will. Justify this however you like, but it really helps to differentiate Ghost's and Dark's offenses. Defensively, it's also no longer completely immune to normal and fighting types. This is probably one of the interactions that I'm most bummed about, but if you think about it too much, Ghost should really be immune to like all physical moves anyway, so let's not dwell on that too much. Okay, moving on. It also doesn't resist Bug because why would it, right? And its weaknesses are the same. Oh, and its battle effect can stay the same too. Not being able to be prevented from switching out of battle is pretty good. Dragon. Okay. This one is going to be a lot. Now, we know that dragons on the whole have some pretty beefy stats, so I realized that dealing an additional super effective hit wasn't actually that important. So it is remaining with just being able to hit itself. It is now resisted by ice types, but steel doesn't resist it anymore, and dragons can actually hit fairy. Okay, defenses. They get to resist elements like fire, water, and electricity, but since grass and nature is so closely tied to the Fae, they don't get to resist grass. Now, I know that people love dragon resisting all of the starter types, and I honestly get that, but grass needed a little love. But for balancing, we are giving it a resistance to ghost instead. This is, again, one of those that I don't have super strong thematic reasoning for, so if you come up with something, let me know. For the effect, I wanted something that really made the dragon type feel wild and untamable. So, when a dragon type knocks out another Pokemon, a random one of its stats raises by 1 stage. Kind of like Beast Boost. This is pretty unpredictable, and I kind of love it. Dark. Well, we can start off by showing that Dark type's offensives are actually completely unchanged. Neat. Good job, Dark type. Defensively, however, it's losing its complete immunity to Psychic, now just a normal resistance. And while it does lose its weakness to Bug, it unfortunately no longer resists Ghost. And then, just for balancing, it gets to resist Ice too. Again, give me some reasoning for that. Dark type's effect stays the same, being immune to Prankster, another one that doesn't come up much in regular play, but is great competitively. Steel. This is the type that I think the most people are going to be upset about. But we all know just how broken Steel is right now. The important thing is that it remains the type with the most resistances. But that being said, we'll be changing a good amount. Offensively, we're being very bold and no longer letting it hit anything for super effective damage. I mean, nobody was really using Steel to deal damage anyway. Then we rearrange stuff so that it is resisted by water, poison, and itself. Defensively, it has lost its complete immunity to poison type attacks. It's going to be dropping from its normal 10 resistances down to 7. We are swapping its ground weakness out for electric, and it is gaining a weakness to psychic, but with the bending of spoons and all. Similar to rock, we can't just give it a resistance to sandstorm chip, and poison is the one that's already immune to poisoning, so those are both no-goes. How about something new and fun? We're going to give the steel type priority on defense and special defense boosting moves. I think that'll be kind of weird and fun. Fairy, our final type, and no surprise, but Fairy is kind of busted. And the poll really showed that thematically, people don't want Fairy to be an offensive threat. So, we are removing its super effective damage against fighting and dragon types. And while fire and poison no longer resist it, it is resisted by grass, psychic, and itself. Defensively, it may lose its weakness to steel, but it can actually get hit by dragons now, though it is resisted, of course. But it no longer resists fighting or bug, instead gaining resistances to ghost and fairy. And for their effect, fairy types are now immune to infatuation. And that's what led to this new type chart.
I honestly can't believe how much time I spent on this project, but it has been fun. Now, I am aware that these changes are probably way too drastic for most people, but I still want to hear what you think. What do you think works? What doesn't? What would you do differently? And a reminder that spreadsheet is down in the description if you want to try your hand at mixing things up too. And if you think that I am just some dumb artist who should stay in my lane, then I invite you to check out some of my other videos. It's good stuff. All right, I hope you have a great day, and I will catch you in the next one. Later, nerds.